In the spring of 1891, a photographer set up his heavy wooden camera on a patch of damp grass in the countryside of Yorkshire. The air was cool, and the faint smell of rain hung above the fields that rolled off into the distance. It was the kind of morning when the world seemed still, the kind of morning when a family might decide to gather outside their home, dress in their Sunday best, and mark a moment in time with a picture that would outlast them all. No one thought much of it. The children were restless, tugging at their stiff collars and lace sleeves. Their parents tried to hush them, telling them this was important, that they must look proper. The house behind them stood as it had for decades, brick walls darkened by smoke from the fireplace, windows that caught the pale sunlight, and a porch where boots had been kicked off after long days in the fields. The family looked ordinary. They wanted to appear ordinary. The father, broad-shouldered and serious, placed his hand firmly on his eldest son's shoulder as if to anchor the boy. The mother stood slightly apart, her dark dress blending with the shadows at her side. She was tall, her face pale, her expression tight with the effort of keeping her younger children still. At her feet, one daughter pressed her hands in her skirts, eyes lowered, while another clutched a small toy that had been hastily taken from the nursery to keep her quiet. In the back, a teenage boy stood straight, too tall for his age, with a kind of stiffness that suggested he wanted badly to be anywhere else. They all held the same gaze toward the camera, that serious and heavy stare so common in photographs from that time, when smiling was rare and every picture felt like a final record to anyone glancing at it. The photograph captured nothing more than a family, frozen in the fashion and formality of the 19th century. But there was something in the air that morning, something no one spoke of, though each of them felt it in different ways. The father's grip on his son's shoulder was tighter than it looked. The mother's eyes seemed to avoid meeting the camera, focusing instead on some point just to the side, as if distracted by a sound only she could hear. The children's fidgeting was not just impatience, but something closer to unease, though none of them had words for it. Even the photographer, who had taken countless portraits for families in the nearby villages, felt a strange discomfort as he prepared the shot. He adjusted the lens once, twice, as though the machine itself did not want to cooperate, that, in truth, the cracks in this family had already begun to spread long before that day. Behind the closed doors of the house, arguments often filled the rooms, arguments that never spilled out into the fields where neighbors might hear, but left their mark all the same. Money had become tighter in recent years. The land that had once provided for them no longer yielded what it once did, and the father carried the weight of that loss heavily. He was a man who measured himself by control, by the strength of his hand and the obedience of those around him. When that obedience faltered, or when the pressure of the world pressed too closely against him, his temper showed itself in ways that left shadows not only on the walls, but in the hearts of those who lived under his roof. The mother, for her part, had grown quieter with each passing year. There had been a time when her laughter filled the kitchen, when she had sung while she cooked or tended to the garden. But that time was long gone. Now, she moved carefully, as if the very air in the house had turned fragile, always threatening to shatter. She tended to her children with patience, but also with a strange distance, as though she were already half removed from them, caught between duty and something darker she could not name. The children lived in this space between fear and familiarity. To them, the moods of their father were like sudden storms, impossible to predict, impossible to avoid. Their mother's silence was a shield, but also a wall that left them with questions no one answered. They played in the fields, they ran down the dirt path that cut through the village. They went to school where their teachers called them polite, well-behaved, perhaps a little withdrawn. No one thought much of it. No one knew that at night, in the stillness of the house, voices carried low but sharp behind doors that never opened to the children. And so, when the photographer arrived that day, the family dressed themselves carefully. They combed their hair, straightened their collars, and wiped the dirt from their shoes. They arranged themselves as families did, presenting an image of unity, of control. Yet beneath the pressed fabric and solemn faces was a current of unease, a quiet tension that no amount of posing could erase. The photograph was meant to show permanence, a legacy frozen in time. But what it truly captured, though none of them could know it yet, was a moment just before everything would begin to unravel. The sixth figure, the one that would later unsettle everyone who looked at that picture, was not noticed then. Not by the father, not by the mother, not even by the children who had earned to keep their eyes fixed where they were told. It was only later, when the glass plate was developed and the image revealed in its pale and ghostly tones, that the presence became clear. For now, all they felt was a shiver that did not belong to the wind, an unspoken heaviness that seemed to cling to them as the shutter snapped closed. That photograph would outlast them all. It would survive fire, rain, and generations of hands passing it along. It would be studied, whispered about, pointed to as proof that something was never quite right about that family, even before the terrible events that would follow. And though no one there that morning could have known it, the image already carried the first shadow of the crime that was waiting just beyond the edges of their carefully arranged world. The photograph had been taken, tucked into its wooden frame, and placed on the mantel as though it marked nothing more than an ordinary season in the family's life. But in the weeks that followed, the atmosphere inside the house grew heavier, pressing against the walls until it seemed even the air could not move freely. The father's temper worsened with the arrival of spring rains that spoiled crops before they had a chance to grow. The soil, once rich and dependable, gave little in return for his endless labor, and the shame of this failure gnawed at him. In a time when a man's worth was measured by how well he provided, he began to see himself not as a husband or a father, but as a man slipping toward ruin. His wife felt the weight too, though in a different way. She watched him return from the fields each evening with dirt clinging to his boots and anger set deep into his face. She tried to speak softly to soothe him, but her words only seemed to sharpen his frustration. Sometimes he turned away in silence. Other times his voice rose, sharp enough to make the children freeze in whatever room they were hiding. On those nights, she would stand her ground for a moment before falling quiet, her hands trembling at her sides, knowing resistance would only worsen what was coming. The eldest son carried the burden differently. At 15, he was caught between boyhood and manhood, old enough to understand the tension in the house, but too young to escape it. His father pushed him harder than the others, sending him to the fields before sunrise and keeping him there until the light disappeared. A man must work, his father said, but there was more than work in his commands. There was bitterness. The boy's growing strength, his silent defiance, felt like a threat, and the father answered that threat with force. The boy began to flinch less at the anger, not because he grew numb, but because he was storing it, like dry wood waiting for the right spark. The daughters watched all of this quietly. The oldest girl, barely 12, had learned how to move unnoticed, how to take her younger siblings by the hand and lead them away when voices grew too sharp. She whispered to them that everything would be all right, though she did not believe it. Her little sister still clutched the ragged toy from the day of the photograph, carrying it everywhere as if it were the only steady thing in her life. They did not speak of fear openly, but it was in the way they lingered together at night, huddled on the same bed when the house shook with their father's fury. The village around them played its part as well. Neighbors noticed the father's scowl deepening each time he passed through town. They spoke in hushed tones about his land, how it no longer produced what it once did, and about the debts they suspected he owed. Pride kept him from asking for help, and suspicion kept him from trusting anyone who offered it. The family became more isolated with each passing week, their once open door closing quietly to the world outside. The mother no longer visited friends as she used to, no longer appeared at gatherings. When asked, she claimed she was busy, but the truth was that she had grown too weary of covering the cracks in her life. Secrets, too, began to rise to the surface, though never spoken aloud. There had always been whispers that the mother had once loved another man before her marriage, someone who had left the village years earlier under circumstances no one fully understood. It was an old story, but in her husband's mind, it was a wound that never closed. Whenever he saw her eyes wander, even briefly, suspicion burned through him like fire. He convinced himself that her quietness was not weariness, but betrayal. He looked at his children and wondered which of them truly belonged to him. He never voiced this directly, but it bled into the way he treated them, some with cold distance, others with sharp cruelty. The eldest son bore the brunt of it most. One evening, after a day of relentless labor, he left his work unfinished. The father's rage erupted. He struck him in front of his younger siblings, not caring about the terror in their eyes. The boy said nothing, but in his silence was a promise, a quiet vow that this would not be forgotten. The mother stepped between them, but the damage had already been done. Something shifted that night, not only in the boy but in all of them. The children began to look at their father differently, not only as the figure who ruled their home, but as the danger within the weeks turned to months. The house itself seemed to absorb their unrest. Shadows fell strangely across the rooms. Doors creaked at night, even when no one moved. The children whispered of noises in the attic, of footsteps where no one stood. The mother dismissed it at first, saying it was the wind, the settling of old wood. But deep down, she felt it too, that the house was holding something it was not meant to hold. When she walked past the mantel where the family photograph rested, she found herself unable to look at it for long. There was something in the picture, some distortion, that unsettled her. She told herself it was just the trick of the light, the blur of movement. But sometimes, late at night, she caught her eldest daughter staring at it with wide eyes, whispering, "There's someone else there." The father ignored these whispers. To him, the photograph was proof of control, a symbol that his family belonged to him, bound together under his rule. Yet the more he tried to hold on to that control, the more it slipped away. His wife no longer sought comfort in him. His son no longer obeyed without question, and even his daughters seemed to shrink from his presence. He tried to bury his failures in drink, something he had resisted for years, but now turned to wit. Alarming regularity. With each glass, his words grew sharper, his hand heavier. The breaking points multiplied. A debt collector came to the house one afternoon, demanding payment that the father could not give. The exchange ended with shouting, a slammed door, and the children watching from the window as the collector walked away, shaking his head. That night, the father raged through the house, overturning a chair, shouting about betrayal and weakness. His wife gathered the children in their room, her arms wrapped tight around them as though her body alone could shield them from his wrath. The eldest son began slipping away at night, meeting with boys from the village who whispered of leaving, of finding work elsewhere, of escaping. The thought tempted him, but something kept him tied to the house. Duty, perhaps, or maybe something darker, a need to see how far things would go, to confront what had been festering for so long. His anger had grown into something sharp and dangerous, something that frightened even him when he felt it rise. The mother found herself caught in a spiral of her own. She wanted to protect her children, but she also carried a bitterness she could not shake. Years of silence had eroded her into someone she barely recognized. She began to wonder what it would be like to live without the weight of her husband's shadow pressing down on her. These thoughts frightened her, yet they came more often. She found herself staring out the window for long stretches, not seeing the fields but imagining another life, one she would never admit out loud. By summer, the tension was so thick it was almost a presence of its own, invisible but undeniable. The children spoke less, their laughter gone. Meals were eaten in silence, the sound of utensils against plates echoing in the heavy air. The father drank more, worked less, and prowled the house like a man guarding something that was already lost. The photograph on the mantel remained, untouched, but never ignored. Each time someone's eyes lingered on it, they seemed to feel that same strange pull, that suggestion of a figure that did not belong. The family had become a collection of secrets and silent wars. No one spoke of what they feared most, but each carried it inside them. The mother feared her husband's rage, but also her own growing desire to be free of him. The eldest son feared his father's hand, but also the violence rising in himself. The younger children feared the shouting, the sudden storms, but also the eerie quiet that followed. Even the father, though he would never admit it, feared the collapse of the world he had built, feared being seen as weak, feared the proof of his own failure. It was this stew of unspoken fears, of secrets and suspicions, that edged them closer to the moment when everything would come undone. And though none of them could yet see it, each argument, each look of defiance, each whispered doubt was a step toward the crime that would stain not only their home, but the strange photograph that had captured more than they had ever intended. The sixth figure in that image had begun as a shadow, a trick of the light. But now, with each passing day, it seemed less like an accident and more like a warning, an omen that their lives were sliding towards something they would never escape. The night of the crime was heavy with heat. The air inside the house pressed against the walls as though it wanted to burst out, carrying with it every unspoke. In word, every unspent rage that had collected there for years. The children had gone to bed earlier than usual, ushered by their mother after a tense supper eaten in near silence. The father had been drinking again, his hands trembling as he gripped his glass, his eyes dark and watchful, darting from face to face as if searching for betrayal. The photograph on the mantel caught the glow of the firelight, its glass reflecting a distorted shimmer, and no one looked at it directly. They had all learned to avoid its stare. The eldest son lingered in the kitchen, pretending to tidy dishes, but really watching his father. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid. He felt the storm coming, the way he had felt it many nights before, but tonight it felt sharper, inevitable, like a line that had finally reached its end. His mother tried to break the tension with a soft question about the fields, but her husband's response was a low growl, muttered words about failure, about the uselessness of effort, about betrayal. Then his eyes snapped to her, accusing, burning with suspicion he had carried like a disease. "You look at me like I've ruined you," he hissed, his voice slurred but sharp. "Like you'd rather be anywhere else with anyone else." She stiffened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't answer, but her silence was enough. To him, silence was always an answer. The eldest son's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to step between them, to break the cycle that had played out 100 times before, but he knew what would follow. He had stood up once and had paid for it with bruises. Still, something inside him was shifting, a pull too strong to ignore. He could feel his heart beating in his throat, his breath shallow and quick. The father rose from his chair suddenly, knocking it backward with a thud that echoed through the wooden floorboards. He stood over his wife, his shadow long and distorted in the firelight. His words tumbled out in a torrent. Accusations of betrayal, of weakness, of shame. He spoke of debts, of children who didn't respect him, of a wife who no longer loved him. His rage was not just against her, but against the world, against the slow collapse of everything he thought he controlled. She finally looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a calmness that startled even her. Years of silence broke in that one moment. "You've already ruined yourself," she said. Her voice low but steady to it was like striking a match to dry tinder. His face twisted, his hand shot forward, and before the son could move, the father's fingers had closed around his wife's arm, yanking her upward with such force that she cried out. The children upstairs stirred, footsteps shuffling nervously across the floorboards, whispers of fear carrying down through the cracks. The eldest son snapped. He crossed the room in an instant, his body fueled not by thought, but by a flood of anger that had been waiting for release. "Let her go," he shouted, his voice breaking with the weight of years unsaid. His father turned, eyes blazing, and in that flash the boy saw not just a man, but a monster, the embodiment of every night spent cowering, every bruise hidden, every scream swallowed into silence. The struggle was sudden and brutal. The son lunged, shoving his father back, but the older man's strength was still formidable, hardened by years of labor. They crashed into the table, dishes shattering to the floor, the firelight throwing wild shadows across the walls. The mother stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth, torn between terror and the instinct to intervene. The daughters upstairs cried out, their voices piercing through the chaos, but neither man heard them. The father's hands closed around his son's neck, pressing him down against the floorboards. The boy gasped, clawing at the iron grip, his vision blurring. Rage burned through him, stronger than fear, stronger even than the pain. His hand groped blindly, finding the jagged edge of a broken plate on the floor beside him. In a single, desperate motion, he thrust it upward. The sound was sickening, the sudden tearing of flesh, the sharp gasp of surprise. The father staggered back, eyes wide, clutching his side where blood began to seep through his shirt. He looked at his son, not with fury this time, but with something closer to disbelief, as if the very idea of being wounded by his own child was impossible. The son scrambled to his feet, chest heaving, his hands shaking as he held the bloodied shard. His father took a step forward, then another, his face pale, his breath ragged. "You ungrateful," he tried to say, but the words broke apart, swallowed by the wet rattle in his throat. The mother moved then, rushing to her husband's side, not out of love, but out of instinct, the way one might rush to steady a falling object. But there was nothing to steady. He collapsed in her arms, his weight dragging her to the floor. Blood pooled quickly, soaking into the wood, spreading in dark rivers that caught the firelight and glistened. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the sobs of the children upstairs. The eldest son dropped the shard, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stared at his hands, at the red that stained them, unable to reconcile what he had done with the fact that it was now unchangeable. His mother looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her expression unreadable, part horror, part relief, part something darker that he could not name. For a long moment, none of them moved. The world outside went on as though nothing had happened, the night pressing quietly against the windows, the field stretching endlessly and indifferent beyond. Inside, though, time seemed to stop. The father's body lay still, his eyes fixed in a vacant stare, the authority he had once held evaporated in an instant. The immediate aftermath was chaos disguised as silence. The mother pressed her hands to the wound, as if she could will the blood to stop, though she knew it was useless. Her mind raced, not with grief, but with calculation. What to do, what to say, how to keep her children safe from what would surely come if the truth were known. The son stood paralyzed, torn between the crushing weight of guilt and a strange, flickering sense of freedom that frightened him even more than what he had done. Upstairs, the children crept down, their small faces pale in the glow of the fire. They saw the scene and froze, eyes wide, unable to understand but knowing enough to feel the terror of it. The youngest began to wail, a sound that seemed "Oh, shake the walls," but her sister pulled her close, covering her mouth, whispering frantically for her to be quiet. The mother rose, her dress stained dark, her hands trembling but steadying as she looked around the room. "We can't let them take him from us," she said, her voice low, urgent. "We can't let them take you." Her eyes locked on her son's, and he nodded without speaking, too consumed by his shock to argue. Together, in that fevered silence, they began the grim work of hiding what had been done. The daughters were sent back upstairs, and the door closed firmly behind them. The mother and son dragged the body, their breaths ragged, their arms straining under the dead weight. Blood left streaks across the floor, smears that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully erase. They moved through the house like shadows, driven not by reason, but by the raw instinct to survive, to conceal, to deny the truth of what had shattered their lives in an instant. The photograph still sat on the mantel, its glass surface catching the fire's glow. In the dim light, the sixth figure, the shadow that had always unsettled them, seemed sharper now, clearer, as though it had been waiting for this moment all along. None of them looked at it. None of them dared. That be why the time the house grew quiet again. The father was gone, his presence reduced to bloodstains and silence. The mother sat at the table, her face pale, her hands folded tightly together to keep them from shaking. The son stood nearby, staring at the floor, his body still tense as though braced for another attack that would never come. The children huddled upstairs, wide-eyed and sleepless, listening to the strange stillness below. The The crime had unfolded not in some grand, premeditated act, but in a storm of rage and desperation that had been building for years. And now, in its aftermath, the family stood on the edge of something darker still. The realization that what had been done could not be undone, that their lives had crossed into a place from which there was no return. The house was silent, but beneath that silence was a new sound, faint and insistent. The echo of a shadow captured long ago in a photograph. The six-figure watching as the family unraveled into blood and ruin. The house did not feel like a home anymore. After that night, every sound seemed louder, every shadow longer, every silence more unbearable. The blood had been scrubbed from the floor, but the stains lingered, faint but impossible to ignore, as if the house itself refused to let them forget. The smell of iron clung to the air for days, no matter how wide the windows were thrown open. The children moved carefully, their voices hushed, as though one wrong sound might bring their father's ghost back through the door. The mother carried herself with a brutal calm. She told the younger ones that their father had gone away for work, a story delivered in a voice that shook only slightly. They wanted to believe her, but the fear in her eyes told them otherwise. The eldest daughter, old enough to understand, said nothing but watched her mother closely, seeing the cracks behind the mask. She knew what had happened, even if she could not say the words. At night, she held her sisters tightly, whispering prayers into the darkness, her own voice trembling with doubt. The eldest son bore the heaviest weight. His hands, though clean now, still felt sticky with blood. He woke in the night, gasping, the image of his father's eyes as life left them burned into his mind. He told himself it had been self-defense, that he had saved his M.O. There is life, but the guilt gnawed at him. He avoided mirrors, unable to look at the face that had done the unthinkable. He moved through the days like a ghost, silent, hollow, his shoulders hunched as if he carried his father's corpse upon them still. Neighbors noticed the change. They asked questions. Where was the father? Why hadn't he been seen? The mother answered with rehearsed lines, claiming he had gone to tend to debts, to visit a relative, to seek better work. But whispers spread quickly in a small village. People remembered the tension, the way he had scowled at gatherings, the way his family seemed withdrawn. Some said he had abandoned them, unable to bear the shame of his failing land. Others suggested darker things, that something had happened in that house, and that the family silence was not grief but guilt. The children were the first to be questioned by others. At school, their classmates whispered behind their backs, asking if their father was dead. The eldest daughter lowered her eyes, refusing to answer, while her younger sister burst into tears and was carried out of the room. The eldest son stopped going altogether, retreating further into himself, unable to face the curious stares. His absence only deepened suspicion. Inside the house, the atmosphere grew heavier by the day. The mother and son rarely spoke of what had happened, but the silence between them was loud, full of unspoken fear. She told him he had done what had to be done, that he had protected them, but her words felt like ash in her mouth. She did not believe them, not fully. She saw the way he stared off into nothing, the way he flinched at sudden sounds. She feared he would unravel before her eyes, and with him, the fragile lie they were holding together. The younger children became restless, plagued by nightmares. They spoke of hearing footsteps at night, of seeing shadows move across the walls. Once, the youngest swore she saw her father standing at the foot of her bed, watching silently. The mother dismissed it as a dream, but her heart raced with fear. Sometimes, when the house was quiet, she too thought she heard him. The groan of floorboards, the creak of a door, the faint rasp of his voice carried through the halls. The photograph on the mantel seemed to shift in the flickering light, the strange sixth figure in it growing more defined, more undeniable. None of them dared touch it, yet none could bring themselves to throw it away. The village's curiosity turned to suspicion, and suspicion soon drew the attention of the authorities. A constable arrived one morning, knocking firmly on the door. He asked about the father, about when he had last been seen, about the debts left unpaid. The mother smiled politely, answered carefully, but her trembling hands betrayed her. The constable's eyes lingered too long on the worn floorboards, on the nervous children peeking from the stairs. He left, but not without leaving behind the promise that he would return. The pressure grew unbearable. The eldest son withdrew further, avoiding his siblings, barely eating. The mother tried to hold everything together, but her own mind was fraying. She replayed that night again and again, sometimes convincing herself she could have stopped it before it turned violent, sometimes convincing herself it had been inevitable. She found herself staring at the spot on the floor where the blood had pooled, her thoughts drifting toward madness. The village began to talk openly. Rumors spread through the market, at the church, in hushed conversations at the pub. Some claimed the father had been murdered, others that he had abandoned his family. Emily's absence from social gatherings only fueled the fire. Children whispered of ghosts in the house, of strange figures seen through the windows at night. The once respected family became an object of fascination and fear, their name tainted by suspicion. The psychological toll was deepest on the eldest son. He could not escape the memory of the moment he drove the shard into his father's side, the sound of his breath rattling as life left him. He began to question himself, to wonder if he had truly acted in defense or if some darker impulse had taken over. He caught himself imagining it again, not with fear, but with a twisted sense of release, and the thought terrified him. He no longer recognized himself, trusted what he might do. The mother, too, changed. Her bitterness toward her husband had turned into guilt for his death, guilt she tried to bury beneath layers of justification. She told herself she had endured too much, that she had been pushed too far, that the violence had been inevitable. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, she wept silently, clutching her children as if they were the only thing tethering her to sanity. She feared the truth would come out, but she feared even more what was happening to her son, the boy who had become both her protector and her reminder of everything lost. When the authorities returned, suspicion sharpened. They searched the property, asking questions the family struggled to answer. The missing father had left too many threads behind. Debts, quarrels, a reputation that made his sudden disappearance impossible to dismiss. Each question chipped away at the family's fragile facade, each visit tightening the noose of truth around their necks. In the village, sympathy turned to judgment. People whispered that the mother was cursed, that the children carried the mark of something unholy. Invitations ceased, doors closed when they passed. Even those who had once been friends crossed the street to avoid them. Their isolation deepened, and with it, the weight of what they carried grew unbearable. The crime, though hidden, had reshaped everything. What had once been a family bound by silence was now a family shattered by it. The father's absence was a wound that would not close, and in its place grew suspicion, guilt, and fear. The mother clung desperately to the hope that they could survive it, that time might dull the questions, that her children might still have a future. But deep down, she knew the truth. The crime had not ended with his death. It had only begun. The photograph remained on the mantel, untouched. Visitors who came into the house often glanced at it, their eyes narrowing as if something about it was not quite right. Some said they counted 6 figures, others only 5, but none lingered long. The family itself avoided it, though it haunted them all the same. It had become more than a picture. It was a witness, and in its silent, unchanging gaze, it seemed to hold the truth that no one dared to speak aloud. The aftermath was not just the absence of a man, but the collapse of an entire world. The crime had left them trapped, between guilt and denial, between suspicion and secrecy, between the lives they had once known and the shadow that now defined them. And though the world outside moved on, inside the house they remained bound to that single night, unable to escape the weight of what had been done, and the haunting certainty that it would never stay hidden forever. In the end, the story of the Harrows stood less like a chapter in a family's private history and more like a mirror held up to society itself. The trial that followed tore through the town of Dunwich like a storm, forcing neighbors, journalists, and even strangers hundreds of miles away to reckon with what had really been hidden behind that 1891 family photograph. In the courthouse, Eleanor Harrow sat with her veil drawn low, her face pale, her hands trembling as testimony laid bare. Years of tension and manipulation. She had lost her husband to a moment of violence, and with him, the security of a life she had tried so hard to control. Around her, the public split into camps. Some saw her as the grieving matriarch undone by secrets too large to carry, while others whispered that she had long been the orchestrator of her family's doom. Charles Harrow's death did not end quietly. The courtroom heard of his infidelity, his debts, and his temper. His carefully polished image as a devoted father and loyal provider crumbled under the weight of witnesses who spoke of his darker sides, and in doing so, the townsfolk were left shaken. Was he a man driven by the pressures of reputation and pride, or had he been the architect of his own destruction? The question of justice became clouded because while Eleanor and her children paid the price of scandal and legal judgment, it was clear that every Harrow had already been punished long before the gavel fell. The children bore the heaviest scars. The eldest son, James, testified with a steady voice but hollow eyes, speaking of nights filled with fear and arguments that rattled the house walls. His future was marked by that memory. He would forever be the boy who had witnessed his father's death and his mother's unraveling. His siblings, too young to fully grasp the trial's proceedings, grew up under the shadow of whispers in schoolyards, their family name twisted into a cautionary tale. Even as they tried to move forward, the ghost of that photograph, the sixth figure no one could explain, followed them, a reminder that their lives had been caught in something larger than themselves. Legally, the outcome was less about punishment and more about assigning blame. Eleanor avoided the gallows, but not the cage. She was sentenced to years in confinement, her health and spirit broken by the end of it. The court saw her not only as a woman complicit in her husband's downfall, but as a symbol of moral decay, a warning to other families who thought wealth and appearances could conceal rot. Yet her sentence did not satisfy the public. For some, it was too light, proof that wealth still protected the powerful, even in ruin. For others, it was too harsh, stripping a grieving widow of her dignity and reducing her to a spectacle for gossip columns. Justice in the Harrow case was never clean. What lingered long after the trial was not the verdict, but the photograph itself. That simple family portrait, meant to capture unity and pride, became the most chilling artifact of all. People studied it with a kind of morbid awe, pointing to the faint outline of the sixth figure that stood among the Harrows. Some swore it was nothing more than a trick of light, a flaw in the camera plate. Others insisted it was an omen, a shadow of death that had come to collect its due. Whether real or imagined, the figure took on a life of its own, a reminder of how fragile the line is between safety and ruin. The broader society took its lessons in pieces. For some, the story underscored the dangers of unchecked power within families, where silence and obedience allowed tension to fester until it broke into violence. For others, it showed the hypocrisy of a world that prized appearances over truth, where reputation mattered more than honesty, and where cracks were ignored until they became chasms. The Harrow tragedy forced people to confront how wealth and status can distort justice, shaping outcomes not through fairness, but through influence, pity, or disdain. At its heart, the Harrow story was never just about a crime. It was about the fragile machinery of human behavior, the jealousy that grows in silence, the pride that refuses to bend, the fear that twists love into control. It revealed how morality bends under pressure, how power inside a household can be as dangerous as power in a courtroom. The family, once admired, became a lesson written in grief, that even the most respectable lives can hide storms, and even the most ordinary photograph can hold secrets too terrible to forget. Looking back, the town of Dunwich never fully healed for what it witnessed. The Harrow estate was sold off, its halls echoing empty until they were claimed by strangers who never quite managed to shake its reputation. The grave where Charles lay grew moss. While Eleanor's final years passed in obscurity, her children left to rebuild their identities piece by piece. Yet the photograph remained, passed down, studied, whispered about, its blurred figure a symbol of how the past never stays buried. The story of the Harrows was one of loss, yes, but also of reckoning. It reminded people that justice is not just about courts and verdicts, but about how we choose to see one another, how we measure truth against lies, and how power, once twisted, can break even the strongest bonds. In the end, no verdict could bring back what was lost. No explanation could fully quiet the haunting questions. All that remained was the chilling memory of a family who smiled for the camera in 1891, unaware that their lives were already unraveling, and that a shadow, whether flesh or phantom, stood beside them, waiting.